Hi, Massimo.
Hey, Bob, how are you?
I can't complain. How are you?
Can't complain either.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and on the any audio podcast app you may have. You are Massimo Pigliucci?
Yes, that's very good.
Is that close?
Yeah, that's pretty close.
Do you really pronounce it Massimo? That's not a very Italian pronunciation, is it?
It is, no, it is an Italian pronunciation.
Is it?
It's often people confuse it with the Spanish maximum, but no, it's Italian pronunciation is that one. Yep.
Okay, so you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. My background is in evolutionary biology and philosophy of science.
Mm-hmm. And before we get to what we're going to talk about, which is scientism, and a book you've co-edited about it called Science Unlimited, The Challenges of Scientism. I want to say that you are centrally involved in the resurgence of interest in Stoicism. And people may be familiar with conversations we had a conversation on Buddhism and Stoicism.
Right.
I'm thinking that may be time for like a fusion tradition, like Boecism, Studism, whatever you want to call it. You laugh. Crazier things have caught on. Hey, Jordan Peterson caught on. That's crazier.
Absolutely. There's a book that just came out recently about the commonalities between Buddhism and Stoicism, just like a couple of months ago, right? I got a preview copy. I haven't read it yet. But so, yeah, you may be onto something here.
Okay. Well, I'll get back to you. But on the scientism business, what is your thumbnail definition of what scientism is?
Right there, you get into the controversy because the book is co-edited with my friend and colleague Martin Badri at the University of Ghent, and about half of the contributors think that scientism is a great idea, the best idea since sliced bread, and the other half think that it's a really bad idea and definitely not comparable to sliced bread. So part of the disagreement here is on the very definition of what it is that we're talking about. Now, I define it the way in which actually most dictionaries define it. If you pick up the Webster, Merriam-Webster, for instance, they will say that scientism is an overconfident attitude in the powers of science. So it applies to any situation when somebody says, oh, there's going to be a scientific answer to that problem, regardless of whether that problem actually is amenable to the methods of science or not. Mm-hmm. Now, the defenders of that position wear that as a badge of honor, and their position is, in fact, that there is no question, no meaningful question, at least, it's not amenable to scientific methodology and therefore answers. And that's where the crux of the discussion is, which means, however, that this isn't just a matter of definitions. It's a question that really goes to the core of the nature of science. What is it that we mean by science, and how do we agree or disagree on it?
Mm-hmm. Now, your view, I take it, is that there is such a thing as exceeding the bounds of science's legitimate realm of authority.
I do, and that is because my starting point is that a particular definition or a particular concept of science, conception of science. Science is one of those things that is basically impossible to define. It's one of those complex concepts that vary through time and culture and so on and so forth. And it's just useless to, start the discussion by saying, well, by science, I mean X. I think it's more, a better approach to things. It's kind of the Wittgensteinian approach, if you want. Wittgenstein famously said that any complex concept does not admit of a simple definition in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. His favorite example was the concept of game. So if I tell you that chess is a game and tennis is also a game, you probably readily agree. I don't think there's going to be much controversy of it. But then there's going to be certain situations where, for instance, are war games actually games, or is that just a metaphor and an analogy? And we may have reasonable disagreements on it. Mm-hmm. What Wittgenstein said basically is that you cannot define clearly the boundaries of the concept game because there are no such boundaries. Mm-hmm. What you do is you communicate with other people and you point to certain things. You say, okay, that's a game, that's not a game, that's something that is kind of in between, and we kind of agree and negotiate what we mean by game. I think the same can be said of science. And my approach to that is that science is a particular family of activities that is done in a certain way in certain times and cultures throughout the history of humanity. So I think that, for instance, Aristotle was doing science when he was going on the island of Lesbos collecting shells and then trying to classify them. But he was definitely doing a different kinds of science. He was using a very different approach to what, let's say, we do after World War II with the National Science Foundation, peer review, and all that. Right?
He wasn't conducting any experiments. He wasn't making any predictions. He wasn't testing hypotheses. In fact, I might question whether that really was science, but of course that's your point. Now let me, we should say by way of foreshadowing that one reason this is if this sounds like some kind of arcane philosophical issue, it is very much burst into the public scene via people like Sam Harris, Lawrence Krauss, Bill Nye, the science guy, Neil deGrasse Tyson. All of them have been accused. Well, they have been accused of scientism and or demonstrated such a low opinion of philosophy as to invite various kinds of accusations from philosophers, whether the accusation is scientism per se. But there's been a certain amount of tension between these people, many of whom, as it happens, are kind of identified with the new atheists, I guess, yes. But not all, and philosophers. There's been this tension, and I guess the most common accusation coming from the philosophers is you are committing scientism when you act as if you have no need for philosophy to address any question of any kind.
Right. That's certainly a very good sort of very general overview of the issue. There are practical consequences to this thing, of course, because one of the things that's happening here is, for instance, that scientists themselves are actually throwing accusations to each other of doing or not doing science. If you think about the string theory and multiverse controversies, fundamental physics. I mean, there is now an increasingly vocal, still I think a minority, but there is an increasingly vocal number of physicists, both theoretical and experimental, who are basically saying, hey, you guys are just going in a direction that doesn't make any sense because you cannot test your hypothesis, so you're not doing science. You're doing, mathematically informed metaphysics. You're doing something different, but not science. So this, and of course, that particular controversy is affecting a major field of science, and it's practical in the sense that we're talking about millions and millions of dollars of funding for the next particle accelerator. Actually, in that case, we're talking billions of dollars. We're talking about faculty position, graduate students, published papers, and so on and so forth. So this actually it has to do in part also with the politics of science, the sociology of science.
Now, in a way, I'm surprised to hear you say, on the one hand, you do object to what you see as scientism, but on the other hand, you actually think there's no good, clear definition of science. Because I would think your average person who worries about scientism has this idea of science as like this area, fairly well-defined area of methodology and of kinds of questions that are legitimately addressed by the methodology, and then it's extending that domain or trying to extend that domain beyond it that is identified as scientism. So I would think your average person who complains about scientism thinks they have a pretty clear concept of what the scope of science is. So I'm surprised to hear you holding these two views.
Right. That's a very good observation. But here, let me give you an analogy, a similar situation where I think my approach makes some sense. Martin and I, a few years ago, published another co-edited book, also for University of Chicago Press, called The Philosophy of Pseudoscience. That one was devoted to pseudoscience, and we see these two books as kind of companions, symmetrical companions, because the one on pseudoscience is about deficiencies of approaching this, of using the scientific approach. That is, there are people that should be using science and don't when they do things like astrology, paranormal, research, and so on and so forth. And the scientism book is sort of kind of the opposite. try to use science where actually I think does not belong. Now, pseudoscience has a similar problem, right? It's not easy to define pseudoscience. Plenty of people have tried. I mean, ever since Karl Popper at the beginning of the 20th century. And it turns out that the consensus among philosophers of science now is pretty much that there is no sharp distinction between science and non-science and pseudoscience. There's no sharp demarcation criterion. That, however, doesn't mean that we don't know pseudoscience when we recognize it, right? So the famous analogy there is with judicial decision about Justin Potter.
I know when I say Potter Stewart, yeah.
Exactly. So the one about pornography versus art is a very similar situation. So how do you go about making people understand what counts as pseudoscience and what doesn't? Well, in that book, in the previous book, there is a chapter that I wrote where I say, look, certain things are very clearly pseudoscience. We can talk about the details, but astrology is a pseudoscience. Lots of paranormal research falls into that category. Intelligent design creation falls into that category. And then there's things that are very clearly not pseudoscience. Particle physics is not pseudoscience. Chemistry is not. Evolutionary biology is not. And so on and so forth. And then there is a part of that territory in between that is kind of interesting because you don't really know. So there are areas, like there are certain approaches to studying the paranormal, for instance, that they're factually done fairly well. Turns out the results are negative or they're not reproducible, but they seem to be done okay. At least for some time in the past, they were done okay. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence is like, it's borderline. Yeah, it's done by scientists. They use radio telescopes, but really there is not a lot of theory behind it. It's not clear where it's going. Social sciences fall in that kind of in-between category as well. So I think that the same goes on the other hand, exactly the same for science. That's right. I don't have a sharp definition of science. But I think there are certain things that are clearly not science. Let's start with the easy ones, right? So literary criticism is not science, for instance. I think that history is not science, although it can definitely benefit from scientific approaches, quantification of data, statistical analysis and things of that sort. But it is inherently a humanistic discipline because it also relies on qualitative evidence, of manuscripts written by people, individual findings that are not really reproducible and so on and so forth. Philosophy, I don't think, is science, although it borders with several areas of philosophy definitely do border with science. Philosophy of science is an obvious one, but even metaphysics. You cannot do metaphysics today if you ignore fundamental physics. You're just playing with nothing. So there's borderlines, but then there are areas of philosophy that are pretty far from it. Lots of epistemology, lots of ethics, I think, is pretty far from it. It can be, interesting. Science can say interesting things about it, but doesn't settle issues. Mathematics or logic. So I did an evening with Lawrence Krauss and Daniel Dennett a few years ago at the University of Ghent, which was actually organized by my friend Martin. And at some point, Krauss just came out and said that, in his opinion, mathematics is a science. And I saw Dennett just doing a little, pivoting around. He's like, wait, what do you mean? And he said, well, they're empirically based. We probably started doing arithmetics by counting on our fingers. Mm-hmm. That's a very good example of confusing two very different things. Yes, very likely human beings started doing arithmetics by counting on their fingers or by counting objects and things like that. But if you mean to say that mathematics as we understand it today, proving Fermat's last theorem is anything to do with that kind of thing, I think you're either deluding yourself or you're trying to pull a fast one on me. Lots of mathematics, the overwhelming majority of what mathematicians do has nothing to do with empirical
So one thing you object to, I think, is people employing any form of reasoned analysis and saying, see, this is science, so this shows that science can handle this too. Why don't we take a specific kind of well-known example by way of clarifying, like, what kinds of conceptions of science are implicit in a given allegation of scientism.
Right.
Let's take Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. Now, it's been a while since I looked at it, but as I vaguely recall, the idea was science can, well, I don't want to oversimplify. I'll get it wrong probably, but the spirit of it was science can settle questions of value. Science can provide our values. Science, it's almost like, what do we need philosophy for? Because ethics is really, I don't know if it's going too far to say that he would say ethics is really ultimately a field of science. So that was the spirit of the claim, at least. And my own intuitive objection is, and what as you read the book, you realize, well, Sam is, like many of us, more or less a utilitarian, which is to say, he thinks that what an ethical system, an approach to ethics should strive to do is maximize overall human welfare or something. And my first reaction is, well, the assumption that human welfare is a moral good, I don't think comes from science. I mean, of course, we all have the intuition that it's good. I mean, most of us, at least, because that's almost a definition of what happiness is. It's what we naturally pursue. But that's an example where I would say that, wait, Sam, there's a question at the bottom of this that science per se cannot answer. Why don't you jump in and tell me how you see this so far?
I think actually, first of all, you remember correctly. That is the gist of the book. Now, my take on, I reviewed the book in detail, and I have to keep going back to it because lots of supporters of Sam Harris keep telling me that I get it wrong. So I go back and check and say, well, is that really what he said, or is it not? My take on that book is similar. If you may remember this, in the 1990s there was the science wars between the postmodernists, or sort of extreme postmodernists, and some scientists and philosophers of science. And at some point, one of the major players in that war was Alan Sokal, who is a physicist at NYU, who pulled this famous stunt of publishing in a postmodernist journal a paper that turned out to be completely fabricated.
By way of satirizing postmodern, by way of showing, in his view, how without solid foundation postmodernism is, he wrote a parody of like a postmodern analysis and actually got it published in a postmodern journal. So yeah,
exactly. Now, Sokal's comment at one point on the whole postmodernist thing was that, in his opinion, what postmodernists tend to write, or at least postmodernists of a certain kind, the kind that he had a problem with, what they tend to write can be interpreted in one of two ways. Either it is a bold statement which is clearly wrong, or it is a statement that is clearly true but trivial. And I think that applies pretty much without much modification to Harris' book, meaning that if he says, if what he is claiming is that science can by itself resolve moral questions that philosophers have been talking about for a long time and without arriving necessarily at a univocal solution, then I think that statement is bold and it's clearly wrong, and we can talk about why it's wrong. Or he's saying that moral decision-making should be informed as much as possible and whenever possible by empirical evidence, which is true, but it's trivial because no moral philosopher would ever disagree with that sort of stuff. So let me give you one specific example. Let's say we're talking about the moral permissibility of abortion. There are a number of arguments, pro and con, which depend on your moral framework. If you're a Christian, you start from certain perspectives, for instance, a particular type of Christian, at least. If you're, as you were saying earlier, utilitarian, you have a certain way of looking at it. If you're a Kantian, you have a different way of looking at it, et cetera, et cetera. But you can build arguments in which you say, look, I'm starting with these assumptions, just like you would do in logic or mathematics. I'm starting with these axioms. And according to these axioms, here's my reasoning for why abortion is permissible or is not permissible. Now, let's assume that the two of us are having this conversation, and we end up agreeing that, sure, abortion is permissible up until the moment in which the fetus begins to feel pain, which is an actual common suggestion that is made in those kind of debates. Well, at that point, certainly the question becomes scientific. At that point, in order to figure out what is our best estimate of when it is that the fetus feels pain, we got to go to the neuroscientist, the developmental biologist, whatever it is, scientist that studies that kind of stuff, and he's going to have, or she's going to have, the best available answer because it is an empirical question. But by that point, all of the philosophical work has already been done. We've already agreed on frameworks, assumptions, reasoning, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and can I suggest that actually, I'm not sure you can turn the question entirely over to the scientists for a reason that gets at another thing you could call scientism, and it's this. In a way, one of the stronger arguments, to my mind, that scientific analysis has limits is this, that I certainly, and again, this is signing on to one particular kind of conception of science, but certainly modern science involves publicly observable data, right? It involves, like, if you're going to do an experiment, you have to be able to, metaphorically speaking, invite someone to watch it and say, see, this was the result, or go do it yourself, and you've got you use the same measuring tools I did, and you'll get the same result. Well, one phenomenon that resists, public observation is subjective experience. No one can have my subjective experience but me. So right away, in trying to figure out when that the fetus might be sentient, you run into that problem. And I actually want to use this this just occurred to me. I know Dan Dennett, I'd be curious as your view of what you think his take on all this is, but it just occurred to me that maybe one critique of his view of consciousness might be that it is, well, it's a form of scientism. Here's what I mean by that. Now, or let's go back and take his mentor, Gilbert Ryle, who was just straightforwardly saying consciousness doesn't exist. People argue over whether Dan's saying that. He says he's not. But in any event, let's take a straight-out behaviorist in the philosophical sense of the term. He says consciousness doesn't exist. You could say that first of all, I think that's a form of confusion, but I think I might argue that the confusion derives from trying to apply science to everything and in effect saying if it's not publicly observable, it doesn't exist. It isn't just that science can't address it, it doesn't exist. Right.
That's right. And I'm glad you brought up the sort of behaviorist approach, because that is exactly what behaviorists were doing. Now, when they were doing it back in the 1950s, that was actually a reasonable thing to do, because they were reacting to a really awful state of research in psychology with all sorts of theories pulled out of thin air about the unconscious and the structure of the unconscious and so on and so forth. So it was actually reasonable at that point to say, you know what, let's start from scratch. Let's move to things that we can only observe in a sort of third party way. But,
well, as a matter of psychological method, I mean, I think you've mounted a good defense of B.F. Skinner's behaviorism as a matter of psychology. But I think the philosophical behaviorism, I don't think B.F. Skinner would necessarily take a position. In fact, I think he explicitly said, I'm not saying there's nothing going on in there. I'm just saying as a matter of science, we can't address it.
Correct. No, absolutely. So you're right. I think that the first person experience is in fact essentially outside of the domain of science, at least the kind of science that we do at this point. I mean, I don't want to talk about 25th century science. We don't know what the hell that would be like. But right now, I don't see anything like that. Now, this is often interpreted in two different ways, which is I find both fairly bizarre. So let's stay, if you don't mind, for a minute on the issue of consciousness, because it's a very good example. So on the one hand, there are people like Ryle, for sure, arguably Dennett, even though he denies it, that say, look, this consciousness stuff doesn't exist. What it is, it's all a bunch of, it's neuronal interactions. Once we get the neurobiology good enough, then the problem of consciousness will be gone. That's it, done. On the other hand, the opposite extreme, there are people like Thomas Nagel, he of the famous, what is it like to be a bat kind of paper. Mm-hmm. Who is also interestingly at NYU, who says kind of the opposite. He says, look, because first person experience is not really approachable by third person, methodology such as scientific ones, then there is something mysterious going on. There is some kind of, David Chalmers will go on and say, there's some kind of dualism at play. There is some bizarre stuff, zombies and all that sort of stuff. And I find, frankly, both positions based on what I think is a category mistake. That is, what these people are trying to do is, in both cases, really, to say that because a certain kind of phenomenon cannot be explained, cannot be interpreted in a certain way, then either the phenomenon doesn't exist, or that's a sort of a indication of something special going on. In reality, what it is very simple, I think. I agree that at some point we may get to a complete understanding of the neural underpinnings of conscious experiences, meaning that there's nothing magical about consciousness. It's a thing that the brain does, and we know that if you turn off the brain, it's not going to happen. It doesn't do it. So I can easily imagine future research showing, look, there's certain areas of the brain has to be involved in this particular way. This is what happens that makes possible for people to have first-person experiences. But to explain how something is possible, it is not the same at all, the same as experiencing that thing. Mm-hmm. I have a certain experience, which of course is made possible by my biology. What else could possibly make it? But the fact that you explain to me, oh, look, there's this particular group of neurons that does this other thing. Yeah, that's very interesting. But I still feel in a certain way, and you don't have access to the way in which I feel. End of story. This is not a limitation of science in the sense that it's a question that right now science won't be able to solve, but eventually will. Neither is it a limitation in the sense of this is by definition, by nature, outside of science. It's just that science doesn't ask that kind of questions. It's science is a set of tools, and those kind of tools simply do not do anything valuable when the problem is not amenable to be solved by those tools. And it's as simple as that, really.
Right. So let's move on to another pretty well-known example of alleged scientism, and this is, one of the most famous philosophical questions is, why is there something rather than nothing? And I think one reason it's famous is because it's pretty clearly unanswerable, right? I mean, so you might even ask whether it's more like a conundrum or something than a question that probably modern philosophers at any rate, have spent a lot of time seriously trying to solve. But in any event, along comes physicist Lawrence Krauss a few years ago and says, I've solved it. Yep. I've solved physics solves why there is something rather than nothing. And his answer involves things like, I don't know. You can start off with a pure, quote, vacuum state, and then stuff emerges. Right. But as people pointed out, a vacuum state is a physical phenomenon. You haven't told us where the vacuum state came from, and so on. And so there was that kind of reply. Did you, anyway, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I think it was David Albert, who is a theoretical physicist and philosopher of physics, who pointed that out about Lawrence Krauss' book in a pretty negative review in the New York Times. I
would say negative is a fair word to apply. That is if you want to see an aggressive and seemingly effective takedown of a book in the New York Times book review, Google that review.
That's the one. Yeah. But I think, unfortunately for Krauss, Albert was right. And he wasn't right in the sense that he said, look, here we are, the philosophers got the answer. By the way, I'm going to go back in a second, if you don't mind, to what is it exactly that's the business of philosophy, because I don't think it's to give answers of that kind. But anyway, but no, it's not that Albert said, look, here we have the answer. You guys, you scientists don't have it. What he pointed out was exactly what you just said. It's like Krauss is redefining nothing. And then he says, and then he pulls this fast one and says, we solved the problem, because if by nothing we mean, whatever fields or whatever, aspects of, sort of some physical pre-existence was there before matter, then now we have an idea of how things come out of nothing. Well, yeah, except that that's not anybody's ideas of nothing. Nothing really is nothing. If you start saying that nothing has a structure and has properties, then it's not nothing. It is something. And you have simply pushed the answer back. Now, that's not to say that partial pushing back is not interesting. I think it is. But you don't get to claim victory.
It was an interesting body of scientific findings he presented in the book, which is called The Universe from Nothing. I had a public kind of conversation / debate with him, which actually got pretty contentious because I got kind of annoyed by what I perceived as just kind of grandstanding. He had kind of, there were a bunch of like ardent fans in the audience, and he was, I thought, kind of evading the questions and playing to the crowd. And so maybe I got a little more assertive than was appropriate for somebody who was nominally the host. But in any event, at one point he said, well, I was pushing him on this, like, well, vacuum state, well, where does the vacuum state, and at one point he said, well, according to physics, these things can arise spontaneously. And I thought, spontaneously? What the hell kind of, that's not an explanation. That's a famous failure to explain. I mean, I can say the universe arose spontaneously. I can make that assertion. But it's a book worth reading.
It's definitely worth a book reading. A book worth reading. But let me go back for a second here to the scope of philosophy, because one of the things that these people, by these people I mean Krauss, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, although apparently he has changed his mind recently. He has talked to somebody who knows a little bit about philosophy, and he's kind of recanted. And actually, Stephen Hawking, who just died recently, he also is on record saying that philosophy is dead because it hasn't actually provided any answer to scientific questions over the last 100 years or so, which is a very strange thing to say for a number of reasons, especially at the beginning of a book like the one that Hawking wrote, which is essentially a book of philosophy of cosmology, because the rest of the book is philosophy of cosmology, as far as I can tell. But regardless, the thing is, we need to really quit, criticizing philosophy for not providing scientific answers. That's not in the business of philosophy. Okay, up until fairly recently, by fairly recently I mean 200 or 300 years, science was philosophy. It was obviously natural philosophy. It was a branch of philosophy. If you had asked, everybody from Descartes to Galileo to Newton to Darwin included, they would have said that they were natural philosophers. Now, then, of course, the scientific disciplines got more and more specialized, and they kind of spun out of the major, core of philosophy, and now they're all independent things. So we have, if we're talking about answering empirical questions on the basis of systematic observations and experiments or any combination thereof, we got science for that. And it does a very, very good job, as much as is humanly possible, at answering those questions by using those methods. Philosophy doesn't really do that. What I think philosophers are in the business of is to clarify issues, to talk about, to open the box, to unpack certain concepts so that we can be clear, or at least a little bit more clear about what we're talking about. They're also in the business of arriving at a number of frameworks that may be useful to think about certain things. And they are in the business of eliminating bad answers and sort of refining the stuff that looks good. So let me give you I think the best example is, we were talking about ethics before. As you know, there's like half a dozen different ethical frameworks that one can use. The three major ones are Kantian-style deontology, utilitarianism, and virtue ethics. Each one of these comes in a variety of different flavors, but pretty much these are the three major players. Now, if you were to say, anybody were to say, well, okay, so which one is true? I would say that's the wrong question. It's not a question. There is no experiment or even no reasoning that can establish that utilitarianism is true. In the same way in which there is no reasoning or experiment that can establish, let's say, that bimodal logic is true, or Euclidean geometry is true. Those things are consistent and or more or less useful, but not true, because they don't correspond to stuff out there in reality. So if you're talking ethics, and it turns out that for certain kinds of problems, a utilitarian approach is useful, and it turns out, we agree that, okay, that's a reasonable way to go, then by all means use it, and be aware of the various criticism to basic utilitarian positions that philosophers have come up with over time. But that's it. So that's, I think, the business of philosophy, to identify those areas in sort of this conceptual landscape, if you will, that correspond to frameworks that are useful to think about stuff, not to determine which one is true. I don't even know what it would mean for something to be true in that.
And in your, there's this piece you wrote about scientism, and we can link to that. That is available on the web somewhere, right? The thing you sent me?
Yeah.
One thing I took away from it is philosophy can also play a role in pointing out that science kind of invokes concepts whose clarity may not be as easy to establish as you think. And one is, you know, what is a cause, right? Now,
exactly.
and you call that a metaphysical question. What will elaborate on like why that's. A lot of people would say, well, I know what a cause is. It was, you know, what would they say? They would say, you know, the earthquake was caused by the shifting of tectonic plates or whatever. But what to a philosopher is problematic about the idea of a cause?
Oh, a lot. In fact, there is like a dozen different accounts of what a cause might possibly be. And the important thing is, before I go, I'm not going to go through all dozen of it, but I'm going to give you a couple just as a flavor. But before we even get there, the thing is, I don't think I cannot imagine an experiment or a set of observations that would actually settle the question, which is why I don't consider it a scientific question, but a metaphysical. Now, for instance, David Hume, famous, you can't talk about causes without mentioning David Hume. David Hume basically thought that the concept of cause is a human psychological invention. He said, all we see are certain things happen and certain other things happen with regularity, with continuity. There's, you know, I bang on the desk and you hear a noise. That's what happens. That's the physical description of the bang. When I say, oh, my banging on the desk causes you to hear the noise, now I'm introducing something that is extraneous. It's a way for the brain to think about stuff, but it really doesn't add anything. If I go there is no cause as an independent thing separate from the banging on the desk and the hearing of the noise. That's one. That's a basic sort of account of what causality is. Basically, causality is a human psychological illusion, in a sense. Now, a lot of modern philosophers, I don't know about most, but a lot of modern philosophers don't buy that, and they have more sophisticated accounts of causality. One of them is that causes are different making processes or factors. So let's say, if I say, oh, my plant died, right, because I didn't water it, right? Well, so that means that I think that water, presence or absence of water, makes a difference to whether the plant lives or dies. And so that even a negative cause, like my not watering it, so my not doing anything, actually is a cause of the death of the plant, right? So in that sense, we're talking about different making exercise. There is yet another account that says, no, causes are physical quantities that are exchanged between objects, and when those physical quantities are maintained, they're not consumed. Like, for instance, momentum, right? Or energy or things like that. So a transfer of energy is a cause of certain kinds of phenomena. All of these are available in the philosophical literature. You never hear any scientists talking about it, and for good reasons. A, because how would you go about doing science with these things? And B, because the scientists don't need it. They have an intuitive understanding of what a cause is within their particular domain, and that's good enough for their practice. I mean, scientists tend to be very pragmatic kind of people. When I was doing research in plant evolutionary biology, I never wondered what a cause was, and yet I had an understanding, a working operational understanding of the difference between causation and correlation, for instance, and I would go and publish papers on it, but not on the concept itself. Just on, I would use those concepts as tools in my day-to-day scientific research.
Yeah. You're mentioning causes reminds me of another sense in which science should maybe acknowledge some of its own limitations, and it's a sense that science itself has created. What I'm thinking of is this idea in quantum physics, and maybe broadly speaking, we should say that, look, quantum physics, just points to, it makes seemingly paradoxical descriptions of reality and so on. It almost says, well, here's the point where the philosophers should take over because we don't know what to make of this. But one thing I'm thinking of is that according to quantum physics, there are things that happen in this universe that have no cause in this universe, right? So like if a particle decays, it's basically a situation where, well, it's going to be heads or it's going to be tails. And according to modern quantum physics, if you say, well, why was it heads? Why was it tails? I mean, after all, with a coin flip, although we call it random, we all think that there's actually a physical explanation of why it came down tails. It was like, it had this velocity, there was this air pressure, and this degree of wind, whatever. We think that that's not truly random. Well, quantum physicists say that there are cases where the outcome is truly random. So whether it's heads or tails has no cause. I mean, you might say it happens spontaneously. Well, to me, that's, in a certain sense, an admission of inadequacy on the part of science. I mean, like, I want to know, why was it heads or tails,
That's right. Yeah, to me, what that says is either that we have to abandon the concept of causality at a quantum level, but then if you do, then you got two questions. First of all, what are you replacing it with? What kind of account are you giving me of what happens at the quantum level? And second, and this is something that lots of physicists just gloss over when you raise the question, is, okay, if there is no causality at the quantum level, but there is at the macroscopic level, how does it come about? So you're telling me basically that causality is an emergent property.
Yeah.
Okay, now you owe me an account of emergent property, and that account better not be just hand waving. You need to provide me with a theory, otherwise you're missing something. But you're thinking, you're talking about quantum mechanics and from fundamental physics. Reminds me of this really very interesting experience that I had 2 or 3 years ago. That really is germane to the issue of scientism and the relationship between science and philosophy. So I get an invitation for a meeting in Munich, in Germany, by a theoretical physicist. And he invites me to give a talk at a workshop on string theory. And I respond and I say, I think you got the wrong guy. I don't do quantum physics. I don't do string theory. I'm not a physicist, and I'm not even a philosopher of physics. So why are you asking me? I said, I know people I can get you in touch with, but not. And then the guy answered, and in a very interesting way. He said, well, look, here's the issue. A lot of my colleagues are accusing each other of doing bad philosophy. By one group is saying, oh, you guys are violating Popper's criterion of falsification, therefore you're not doing science. The other side is saying, oh, you guys are paparazzi. That's actually a term that Sean Carroll, for instance, the cosmology, has actually used on Twitter. You're paparazzi, you're just sort of fundamentalists about Popper, but you don't really understand what's going on. And I said, okay, what do you want me to do? He said, well, at the beginning of the conference, why don't you give him a one-on-one introduction to what Popper actually said, as opposed to the Wikipedia version of Popper, and you tell us kind of more or less where philosophy of science is. And I accepted. That was a fascinating, experience for me. The book, by the way, is coming out now that collects all those papers. But it was a fascinating experience because here I was right in front of me were a couple of Nobel Prizes. These are people who really smart and really know a lot about physics, and yet they clearly didn't have much of an idea of what they were talking about when it came to the philosophy. Naturally so, because it's not their field, right? Mm-hmm. That was a good example, I think, where philosophy becomes useful to science. Not because it answers scientific questions, because again, we got science for that. It's got it covered. Mm-hmm. But science sometimes, not just physics, but physics in particular right now, gets to a point where the question becomes really one of frameworks or methods of conceptual issues. And at that point, that's where the philosopher can come in, sit at the table and say, okay, here's what's happening. Here's what my contribution is. Let's try to clarify things and see where the thing can go. The philosopher isn't going to do the experiment, but it's going to help you try to figure out what is the epistemic warrant of your statements. Why is it that so many people think that a theory is in trouble? From a conceptual perspective and so on and so forth.
Right. And to stay with physics, and I mean, kind of at the risk of repeating myself, but it is interesting that physics, I think, unlike any other field, I mean, there are interfaces between biology and philosophy, and we can talk about those, and I do want to turn to those, but the interface between physics and philosophy is distinctive, or at least one of them, because like with quantum physics, unlike really all other parts of physics, I think, and all other parts of science that I can think of right now, with quantum physics, you get findings where just the natural reaction is, how do we interpret this? What is the interpretation of saying that sometimes this thing looks like a wave, sometimes it looks like a particle, it seems like it's a wave until we measure it, and all these kinds of things. And so it seems to force interpretation that is arguably of a philosophical nature. And then, of course, there is this school of thought in physics that, no, you just shouldn't. And maybe this is, in a sense, maybe this is a commendable recognition of the limits of their field. You know, maybe they're not saying there is no interpretation. They're just saying, hey, we don't want to do the interpretation. I mean, there are physicists who want to get into the interpretation part, and some of them might go say kind of outlandish seeming things like, well, I think consciousness itself brings the wave into more distinct manifestation, the manifestation of a particle. It's the consciousness in the measuring. They like go out and say things like that. Not many of them hold that particular view, but they say things like that. And then some of them just say, no, don't use the word interpretation, right?
Correct. In fact, last time that I counted, there are more than a dozen different interpretations of quantum mechanics. And even though some physicists, like, again, Shankarl, argue that in theory, possibly at some point, some of these interpretations might be actually separable on empirical grounds. Right now, they aren't. There are interpretations. And as you say, once you get away from the data, from the so-called shut up and calculate school of quantum mechanics, then you run immediately into metaphysics. It's clearly science-informed metaphysics. It's not the kind of, it's not Deepak Chopra that we're talking about here. But it is metaphysics. And there may be non-empirical reasons to prefer one interpretation over another, because different interpretations, of course, entail a different way of looking at the world. Or, as you say, there may be the most honest thing to say there is just to say, look, that's it. We reached the limit of what a human interpretation can do. But as soon as you start talking about understanding and interpretation as opposed to directly what the data are telling you, then you're doing philosophy, or at least philosophically informed science. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned biology, which of course is in fact my field. In biology, there is lots of questions where philosophers have been helpful or are being helpful at the moment. Like the classic one is the concept of the species concepts. So there are the idea of a biological species is fundamental in evolutionary biology and in other areas of biology, and yet there are like more than 2,000 different concepts of species out there on the market. And a lot of the literature on species concepts is, in fact, philosophical in nature. And that's an area where you will see biologists and philosophers co-authoring papers in either biology journals or philosophy of science journals to try to get a little more clear. It would be naive to imagine that, more than 150 years after Darwin, we will solve the problem of what a species is by collecting more data. We got a lot of data. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of data on what different kinds of species are like, how they behave, all the way down to the molecular level. Mm. More data isn't going to do it. It's a question of, why are we thinking in these different ways? What is it that brings us to conceptualize biological species in a certain way? What kind of work do those conceptualizations actually do? Is it useful? Is it not? Right. Is there a situation where one conceptualization is more useful than others for particular applications? Those are the questions. They're not empirical questions.
Right. Now, as I recall, Darwin himself raised questions about the species concept because, of course, in The Origin of Species, he was trying to defend the then radical idea that a species can change gradually. And so he actually made the argument that this thing we think of as a fixed type actually has internal variation. It actually, how different is this thing we call a species from the thing right next door, and so on. So he raised these kind of sophisticated questions, and I think one answer might be that your assumption that there is such a thing as a species is an illusion, a mistaken inference from the way you use language. Just as you might critique Plato's idea of the forms, like Plato's idea that, well, there's an ideal chair out there somewhere that is the Platonic chair, you might just say to him, no, look, we just, as a matter of linguistic convenience, we lump a bunch of, in fact, different things under the label of chair. It makes communication more efficient, but there's no such thing as a pure chair. And you might make the same critique of the idea of species. It makes sense as a way to talk about the life we see around us, but if you look at the way evolution works, I don't want to sound too Eastern, but all is change, it's all flux.
Pantare, as Heraclitus would say. So Darwin, for instance, was what modern philosophers of science call an anti-realist about species. So he really did not think that species were out there, in the real world, that these are convenient categories that the human mind creates in order to make sense of complex patterns, but they're not really out there, which, as you say, served him very well in terms of his theory of sort of gradual change. But then the modern synthesis came. That's the currently dominant version of evolutionary theory, which kind of solidified between the 1920s and the 1940s. And according to the modern synthesis, actually species are real, and they are defined real, not in a sharp boundaries kind of sense, but they are real, meaning they're clusters of properties, and those clusters are defined mostly by the ability or lack thereof of organisms to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That was, the major architects of the modern synthesis, Theodosius Dobzhansky, Ernst Mayr, and so on and so forth, who, by the way, knew a hell of a lot of philosophy and argued, in fact, on philosophical grounds, in part, came up with this idea. Now, move forward another, several decades to the beginning of the 21st century, and my sense now is that there is a split within the biological community. There is a good number of people who still think that the so-called biological species concept is valid, and that's the one that I just referred to, the one based on interbreeding. There's a second group of people who think in terms of a phylogenetic species concept, because phylogenetic analyses have taken over evolutionary biology since the 1960s and 70s. And then there is another group of people, to which actually I belong, who is pluralist about species concepts. And what we're pointing out is that, look, different groups of organisms, different kinds of organisms behave actually in terms of boundaries of reproduction and fertility and all that sort of stuff in very different ways. So something like the biological species concept based on interbreeding works actually remarkably well for a lot of vertebrates, for instance, and several kinds of invertebrates. But if you go to bacteria, it's all out, because bacteria don't even have sex in the same way in which we think of it as vertebrates. They're much more porous. They exchange stuff all over the place, and it's not really clear what a species of bacteria would be. You go to plants, and they do something completely different. I mean, if I just the other day I went to the botanical gardens here in New York and Bronx, and they have their annual exhibit of orchids. Orchids are fascinating because botanists do recognize a number of different species of orchids, but it's so easy to interbreed them. It's amazing. In fact, most of the most beautiful orchids you get are hybrids between different species. Well, according to a biological species concept, that ought to be impossible to do. You shouldn't be able to do it. If they're really species, then you shouldn't be able to interbreed them. Well, guess what? You just go to the botanical garden and you'll see there's a bunch of those things. And yet very few botanists actually doubt that these are separate species because they are separate ecologically, geographically, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So that's another area where there is a lot of interesting discussion going on. And these discussions are, and here's one of my favorite terms in philosophy of science, all of these discussions tend to be underdetermined by the data, meaning that the data is compatible with more than one possible answer. And whenever that is the case, that's a pretty good indication that you're now getting into philosophical territory. If your data do not actually univocally determine the answer, then there is room for interpretation, then there is room for examining assumptions and axioms and things like that, and now you're doing philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about, as long as we're on biology, we talked about ways that philosophy can ask questions about the way scientists are doing things or talking about things that might force them to clarify their terminology, or at least critically examine their own terminology or methodology or something. It seems to me, in principle, the influence can flow in the other direction from science to philosophy. And what I have in mind is, again, biology. or at least an extension of it, kind of evolutionary psychology or whatever, if you accept the claim that certain of our moral intuitions are products of natural selection, that might influence the way you invoke intuition in philosophical discussion of ethics, and it might lead to less of a tendency to invoke them, arguably. Might even, some people might argue that it challenges ethical discourse at a pretty fundamental level, because it's like, wow, once you start doubting everything you feel about ethics, what can you say with confidence? But anyway, there is that, in principle, that direction of influence, right?
Yes, and that brings us to something we haven't mentioned yet, and kind of brings us full circle to Sam Harris again, I guess, and that is the is-ought problem, right? So I mean that the is-ought problem suffers from a similar issue.
And we should say this is the idea of inferring ought from is. In other words, inferring some value statement, the way things ought to be, an assertion about the way things ought to be, about what's good, from just empirical observation of what is. It's also called the naturalistic fallacy.
Correct. Now, I find it interesting that, again, you find, just like in the case of consciousness that we were discussing earlier, you find two diametrically opposite positions that I think are both mistaken in a serious way. So the Sam Harris or Michael Shermer's and so on and so forth of the world would simply deny that there is an is-ought gap. They would say, look, it just, values are a particular kind of fact, and that's it, end of story. Therefore, which of course they need to do, because otherwise you're not going to be able to argue that science, which is empirically based, is going to answer moral questions, right? Okay, so that's one way to do it. It's just abolish, the gap is an illusion. Then there is a number of philosophers, frankly, who get overly defensive, and they say, no, the gap is absolute and unbridgeable. David Hume showed that famously in an inquiry concerning human understanding. And that's it. There are two different kinds of things. They're qualitatively different. There will never be a bridge between the two. I think that both positions are mistaken. First of all, Hume never said that the gap is unbridgeable. The famous sentence, the quote that it's often mentioned in this context, actually says, if you read it in the full context of what he was talking about, he says, look, I've noticed that some people start talking about facts and then they slide into talk of values without bridging them. And it seems inconceivable that you could do that. You need to give me an account of it. So what I think Hume was saying is inconceivable is not that there is a gap or that there isn't a gap, is that you shouldn't go from one to the other without giving an account of how it is that you're doing it. So now Hume himself, like myself to some extent, was what we would today call a naturalist in terms of ethics. Right? So I think that ethics does have roots in biology. Hume was thinking about psychology mostly. I'm thinking biology and psychology, and both of them. So if you're a naturalist, you cannot possibly say that there is an unbridgeable gap between values and facts, because otherwise you become sort of a kind of a Platonist about values. You say the values are out there independently of sort of human conditions, human empirical situation. That I don't see how anybody could defend that. I mean, there are some philosophers who try, but I don't think their defenses are particularly convincing. But at the same time, it isn't just a matter of facts on the ground, because you could say, for instance, going back to your example. So let's say that biologists and psychologists would show that certain things, certain kind of moral feelings are natural in human beings. Let me give you a specific example. Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist at
NYU, the business school at NYU, I think.
That's right. He showed that for certain people that self-identify in the United States as conservatives, there are certain kinds of very strong emotional reactions that they have, that they interpret as moral reactions to things like, for instance, desecrating the flag. Okay? If you tell them, I'm going to flush the American flag down the toilet, they say, that's just completely unacceptable. It's repulsive, and so on and so forth. Now,
and he says they put, in general, what this derives from in his view is these are people who put just particular emphasis on purity as a value, kind of. It isn't just a statement about what the flag means to them, strictly speaking, but he's saying that conservatives are more drawn to purity, and I think authority, and liberals to fairness or something. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, Now, let's even say within the framework of somebody who agrees that, oh yeah, there's this strong feeling about doing certain things that are called against objects or concepts that are considered sacred. Well, let's agree even that that's a natural thing, that human beings have a natural tendency to think that certain things are sacred and therefore that violating them is immoral. Great, fine. That's a fact about human psychology. You can still meaningfully ask the question, yeah, but should we really feel about that in that way? And that opens up to the philosophical discussion. Say, well, let's talk about this thing. Maybe these feelings evolved in a certain environment in which it made sense for human beings to develop those strong reactions to certain kinds of actions. But now we live in a different kind of environment, and it doesn't really serve the purpose of sort of human flourishing, let's say, to keep thinking and feeling along those lines. And so maybe we should try to correct that kind of behavior. We should try to get out of it, right? So what I'm talking about here is a kind of ethics, like I think the Stoic ethics is, and probably from what little I know, the Buddhist ethics, which is based on empirical notions about what a human being is. Ethics, let's not forget, comes from the Greek word for living in society, getting along together in society, okay? That's what it means. And we definitely agree that there are empirically better and worse ways to live in a society, to build a human society, if the goal is flourishing of that society and on the individuals within that society. Where I'm going to disagree with the Sam Harris's and Michael Shermer's of the thing is that they seem to think that the data would in fact determine the answers to that kind of questions, and I think they underdetermine them. Mm-hmm. So there is lots of room for discussions about, given the certain facts about human nature and given certain facts about human psychology, there still are several different ways to go. And now we have to have a conversation about them. And that conversation becomes philosophical, informed by the empirical evidence. But it's not just scientific.
Yeah, so you're alluding to a second kind of connection. I mean, I had brought up the question whether, well, once you know that your moral intuitions are, you might say, mere products of natural selection, or at least that's the argument, does that influence the extent to which you trust them? There's that. There's also just, if your goal is to make people happy, understanding human psychology and what makes people happy. And of course, I'm both Sam and Michael Shermer, I'm sure, would emphasize that. And I certainly think that's a valid path of inquiry. But to give you an example of another question that it doesn't answer, if aggregate happiness is the what you want to maximize, well, what if you can make overall happiness a little higher, but that increases the inequality of happiness among the population? In fact, we know that happens with just wealth. There can be that kind of trade-off. Well, what do you do then? Well, I mean, what is an acceptable trade-off? I can't conceive that anybody thinks science can tell us what an acceptable trade-off is.
Correct. In fact, that's even on philosophical grounds, that's a classic objection to utilitarianism. That is, yeah, sure, you can. Right. Interestingly, by the way, I don't think it's by chance at all that Harris and Michael Shermer are essential utilitarians. If you remember, utilitarianism came about from Jeremy Bentham, who literally wanted to that's what he wanted to do. These people are not inventing anything new. Bentham wanted to put ethics on scientific footing, and he wanted to arrive to what he called the hedonic calculus, an actual equation that would tell you how you should run society. Well, we all know how that ended up. It didn't really work out. He had no idea how you could possibly do something like that. But one could question the premise, and then one can say, look, even if we could arrive at some kind of function that you can maximize human happiness and minimize human pain, there are many, many different ways of arriving at that maximization. A lot of complex problems in mathematics admit of multiple peaks, multiple answers, right? And now how do we choose among those? If it turns out, as you were saying, that let's say, empirically speaking, we're going to improve significantly overall happiness by allowing gladiatorial games into the arena, let's say, and by violating people's basic rights and indulging in gory sort of spectacles, are we going to do that? Are we sure there's no objection to that kind of thing? I think there are plenty of good objections to that stuff.
Well, and this actually leads to another thing you say in this piece, and we can close with this issue because we've gone on for about an hour now. But it's about, in my mind, potentially this raises a question of an intersection between another kind of intersection between philosophy and science. What you write is in aesthetics, is there a meaningful difference between Mill, meaning John Stuart Mill, another 19th century utilitarian like Bentham, between Mill's low and high pleasures? I assume you're referring to where he says, I would rather be Socrates unsatisfied than a pig satisfied or something like that, because I'd rather just stay on the high plane, even if it means being discontented, even if it means suffering, than indulge then get gratification of a very base kind. And you raise the question of, is there a meaningful difference between the low and high pleasures? Now, one thing you do is try to map it onto the brain and say, well, for starters, if we look at everything Mill or somebody would call a low pleasure as opposed to high pleasure, is there anything in it? That's one place you could go with this that involves an intersection of philosophy and science. I don't know what else you might have had in mind.
Well, what I had in mind, in part, yes, you're absolutely right. You could do that sort of stuff. Now, the thing is, even if you quantify things, right? So let's say, for hypothesis' sake, for argument's sake, let's say it turns out that brain scans tell you that people have a lot more pleasure out of playing video games and taking drugs than going to the opera or reading a novel, which would be very good examples of the low versus high pleasures that Mill was talking about. And in fact, Mill introduced that distinction precisely because he realized that his mentor's Jeremy Bentham's approach to utilitarianism was going to be open to these kind of objections. That is, that everything will go to a minimum common denominator, essentially. So if it turns out that that's what the data tells you, so does that give you a good reason to bring society to a minimum common denominator and have everybody playing video games or take drugs or whatever it is, and so forget about Picasso and Verdi and so on and so forth? I don't think it would, because there is all sorts of other interesting things there. They are qualitative. I mean, there is a lot of human culture there. There is a lot of human values that come out of things that are pleasurable in a very rarefied sense. May be accessible only to a small portion of the population. That's unfortunate, but maybe we should work on that rather than, say, okay, forget about Shakespeare. Let's just go to the stadium and watch the soccer game or something. Not that there's anything against soccer games, because I'm a fan. Right? So that's the kind of thing. I mean, how would you go about answering that question? Yes, the data, the neurobiological data may give you a pattern description, but they're not going to tell you which way you should go. And so it's a very interesting confusion that these people like Harris and Sherman and so on and so forth make. My analogy sometimes when I want to try to explain what the difference is between sort of going to the neurobiology and then going outside of the neurobiology is, imagine that instead of talking about ethics, we were talking about mathematics, which, by the way, I think it's a human construction. I don't think I'm not a Platonist about mathematics. Mm-hmm. The analogy that I'm about to make actually holds because of that. If you're a Platonist, then it's a different issue. But I think that mathematics is a human invention. Very useful, very sophisticated, but it's a human invention. Fine. So you could put the brain of mathematicians or the brain of anybody that tries to solve mathematical problems in an fMRI machine and say, look, here's what happens to your brain when you're trying to solve mathematical problems. Yes, but the fMRI pattern isn't going to tell you whether the solution is right or not. You need a mathematician there who actually knows what he's talking about and can derive the proof for that solution, and then you know whether it's right or not. So describing how things work in the brain is crucial. It's a very important bit of science that we definitely want to do. But this idea that once you do that, somehow you've gotten to the bottom of it, and somehow that's the most significant, most pertinent level of explanation, I think that's just nonsense.
Okay, well, we can end with that word, nonsense. But I want to give you a chance. I mean, two things. I want you to tell people where they can find your work, including your work on Stoicism. But first, is there anything else you want to say about the book? It's called Science Unlimited, The Challenges of Scientism. Many distinguished scholars contributed to it. It's got, 15 chapters?
Yes, that's right.
Addresses like all conceivable aspects of the question, just about. Anything else you want to say about the book? It just came out a couple of months ago.
That's right. So I mean, the book is a good vehicle for these kind of discussions precisely because it's designed not to have a point of view. It has multiple points of view. from one extreme to the other to kind of intermediate positions. There's several authors there who take kind of intermediate positions. And so I think it's a great exercise in critical thinking. You read the book, and then by the end of it, you say, okay, this particular author, I think, has a better point than another one. So that's about the book. In terms of where to find me, other than on Twitter at mpigliucci, P-I-G-L-I-U-C-C-I, M-P-I-G, my two blogs, Footnote.org, which is where I write about general philosophy, and howtobeastoic.org, which is what I write about my journey into Stoicism. Fun fact that I just realized yesterday, because I was going over some of the stuff that I publish in my blogs, and it kind of scared me once I realized it. Since I publish on both blogs at least weekly and sometimes bi-weekly.
I saw this, yeah.
Right?
I think you tweeted about this, yeah. You've
right,
written the equivalent of how many books on your blogs?
About 5 books a year, which is kind of, maybe I should be doing something else.
It's a question we all face increasingly.
Right.
But
anyway, there's a lot of free content. That's the point.
A lot of free content. They should be grateful they're not having to go to a bookstore and pay for it. And so good. So that's where. So how to be a Stoic is where you go if you want to become Massimo's disciple. You already have a lot of them. I think this is like a growing thing. This is consuming a lot of your energy, right? The Stoicism thing. It's got legs.
Yeah, it is. It's become a major thing for me to do now. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. So I recommend it to people. Well, thanks a lot, Massimo. Let's do this again before too long.
It was a pleasure, Bob.